Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're looking at a huge stack of research, but it's really all anchored by this incredible 2026 book, The Black Book of Reshoring, The Essential Guide to America's New Manufacturing Boom by Douglas Brown.
It's a fantastic text. Really eye-opening.
It totally is. And our mission today for you, the listener, is to untangle what is basically the greatest economic plot twist of our lifetime.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, why is the cheap labor globalization model that you and I grew up with suddenly dead? And why is the world just, rapidly rewiring its supply chains to bring all this production back home?
Yeah, the scale of the shift is it's monumental.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because for decades, the gospel of global business was so simple. You ship it overseas, you manufacture it for pennies, and you just don't ask questions.
Right, you just look at the profit margin.
Exactly. But now we're seeing these multi-billion-dollar tech and manufacturing hubs springing up right in our own backyards. And the author has this great opening anecdote about a shuttered steel plant in Dunkirk, New York.
Oh, yeah, the Dunkirk story.
Right. Like, the silence of globalization there used to feel so permanent, but now it's literally being replaced by this new high-tech hum of advanced manufacturing. So how did we get from maximum outsourcing to this frantic rush to build on domestic soil?
Well, to really grasp it, we have to look at the altar the global economy worshipped at for, the last 40 years. Mm-hmm. And that is the altar of extreme efficiency.
Yeah.
The whole strategy was to stretch supply lines as thin as theoretically possible just to, maximize those quarterly corporate profits.
Just squeezing every last cent.
Exactly. But the author meticulously lays out how a series of global stress tests basically shattered that model.
Like what kind of tests?
Well, you had the 2008 financial crash, the escalating trade wars of the 2010s, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic. They completely exposed that hyper-efficiency as, extreme fragility.
Oh, wow.
In fact, there's a line in the text that I think perfectly captures the systemic failure. The author says, just-in-time supply chains turned into just out-of-stock crises.
Just out-of-stock crises. That's so accurate. Which means, we didn't just wake up one morning and decide to bring factories back to places like Ohio or Tennessee out of some misplaced nostalgia.
No, not at all.
The fundamental math of global business actually changed. Like, it's a completely causal transition. Time, physical risk, computing power, it's all been repriced.
Yeah, the old spreadsheet calculation was pretty straightforward, right? The cheap hourly wages overseas easily outweighed the logistical inconvenience of the distance.
But that calculation has totally collapsed.
Exactly, it's collapsed. And the book gives this fascinating look into how time itself has been repriced on the factory floor. He focuses on this phenomenon he calls the weekend that disappeared.
Oh, I love that section. It was mind-blowing.
It really is.
Let's dig into that for a second. Like, how a factory changeover used to work versus now, because it really highlights the contrast.
Sure. So, in the past, if a massive facility needed to switch over to a new product line, say a new car model or a different electronic device, they would basically have to shut down the entire floor on a Friday night.
Just pull the plug for the weekend.
Right. And crews would spend the entire weekend manually swapping out dies, reprogramming robotic arms line by line, stacking pallets, taping paper instructions to machines.
Ugh, the manual labor involved in that.
It was massive. And then they'd hold their breath on Monday morning, just hoping the new line wouldn't spit out a mountain of defective parts.
But now,
thanks to artificial intelligence, the AI runs 1,000 digital simulations overnight.
And it doesn't even need to order a bunch of lukewarm pizzas at 2 a.m. to keep morale up.
Exactly. No pizza required. That is the reality of the modern floor. A model update just drops into the system in the middle of the night.
Using digital twins, right?
Yes, digital twins. Which is basically a hyper-accurate virtual 3D simulation of the physical factory. The software rehearses the entire production run while the night shift is taking a break.
That is wild.
It identifies all the collision points or inefficiencies in the virtual world. So by the time the machines physically move, the new product runs with a 99% first pass yield.
Meaning almost zero defective parts on the very first try.
Exactly. The weekend didn't get longer. The factory just got exponentially smarter.
Wow.
And when you can execute a complex changeover overnight using AI, waiting 4 weeks for a shipping container from Asia suddenly looks like a terrible business decision.
Because the historical advantage of cheap labor just gets totally neutralized by algorithmic speed.
Right on the money.
I look at the old global supply chain like a giant Jenga tower. The foundational blocks are being manufactured like 10,000 miles away. It's incredibly efficient and profitable right up until someone bumps the table.
And the whole thing comes crashing down.
Exactly. But wait, I have to stop you there and push back a little.
Okay, go ahead.
For my entire adult life, globalization was sold to us as this inevitable force of nature, like gravity. We were promised that a rising tide lifts all boats, right? That free trade would eventually benefit everyone.
That was the narrative, yes.
So, are you saying the smartest economists in the room just completely miscalculated the math?
Well, the data in the text suggests the strategy essentially ate itself.
Ate itself? How?
Corporate profits undeniably soared during that era of aggressive outsourcing, but that promised rising tide completely bypassed the actual workers whose jobs were shipped away.
All right.
The author points to a really sobering statistic. By 2016, median household incomes in vast swaths of the United States were actually lower than they had been in the year 2000.
Wait, really? Lower than in 2000?
Yes. Entire communities had just been hollowed out. And on top of that, geopolitical shocks brutally demonstrated that having the lowest possible unit cost on a spreadsheet means absolutely nothing if your cargo ship gets wedged sideways in the Suez Canal.
Or if a factory shuts down because of some sudden diplomatic rift. Because a low unit cost is meaningless if the physical product never actually arrives at the loading dock.
Right. You can't sell a spreadsheet.
You cannot. And that vulnerability triggers the next massive transition in our sources. Because that old math collapsed under geopolitical risk, nations aren't treating critical manufacturing as standard business anymore.
No, they're treating it as national security.
Exactly. They are treating these sectors as vital national security assets. We're literally witnessing the birth of a new geography of power.
What's fascinating here is the selectivity of this boom.
What do you mean by selectivity?
Well, this isn't some sweeping, nostalgic return of every single factory job. The textile mills and cheap consumer electronics assembly lines, they aren't coming back to the American Midwest.
Because the margins are just too thin?
Exactly. Those industries operate on razor-thin margins. So they're shifting to friend-shoring hubs instead. Places with favorable trade agreements and lower costs like Vietnam, Mexico, and India.
Okay, so what is coming back?
The U.S. government and corporate giants are specifically targeting what the text calls sovereignty.
Ah, sovereignty. We're talking about the absolute frontline industries here.
Yes.
Semiconductors, electric vehicle batteries, aerospace, defense components, and APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients that actually make our medicine work.
Exactly. This is all about building endurance into the national system, and you can physically see it redrawing the map of the country.
Oh, totally.
The book dedicates several chapters to these new industrial clusters. You have the battery belt solidifying across the South and Midwest, with these gargantuan gigafactories rising in states like Tennessee, Kentucky, and Michigan.
And then there's the Silicon Heartland.
Yes. Look at Intel's megafab in Ohio. I mean, it was initially projected as a $20 billion investment, and with expansions, it's pushing closer to $30 billion.
$30 billion. That scale is almost difficult to wrap your head right around.
It's massive.
But, reading through the text's fault line alerts, a glaring issue jumped out at me.
Let's hear it.
So we're pouring billions into this massive battery belt, right? But we still rely heavily on places like Chile for lithium and the Congo for cobalt.
Right.
And we know from the research that we don't just mine these minerals domestically because of, massive environmental pushback, strict zoning laws, and a total lack of localized processing infrastructure.
Yeah, the infrastructure just isn't there.
So aren't we just trading our old problematic dependence on foreign oil for a brand new dependence on foreign minerals?
That is the exact blind spot the author warns about.
Really?
Yes. True sovereignty or real energy independence requires incredibly secure inputs. If the U.S. fails to secure domestic extraction, or at least tightly allied supply chains for critical minerals like lithium, nickel, and cobalt,
Then what happens to the gigafactories?
and those multi-billion-dollar gigafactories are nothing more than giant assembly halls waiting on fragile global flows.
Oh, wow. So the core vulnerability hasn't actually been eliminated.
No. The choke point has merely been moved further upstream.
We are still incredibly vulnerable to disruption.
Absolutely.
And because securing those choke points is critical to national survival, governments are just deploying astronomical sums of subsidy dollars to force the market's hand.
Yes, the subsidies are unprecedented.
And we're talking massive legislative packages like the CGPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. But here is the brutal reality check. Government money cannot physically pour concrete.
No, it cannot.
and it certainly cannot bypass regulatory red tape.
That's the friction. The ribbon-cutting ceremonies are always spectacular, right? Politicians beam for the cameras, promising thousands of jobs and generational prosperity.
Lots of smiling with giant scissors.
Exactly. But the data inside the project management trailers tells a much grimmer story. According to the book's analysis, building a state-of-the-art facility in the U.S. carries a massive premium. It costs anywhere from 30% to 50% more than constructing an identical counterpart in Asia.
30 to 50% more? That is a huge premium. And we can't forget the cautionary tale of Foxconn's campus in Wisconsin.
Oh, the Foxconn story. A perfect example.
The company promised, 13,000 high-tech jobs?
Yeah.
The state offered billions in subsidies to win the contract, and years later, it essentially became an empty shell.
It's the ultimate reminder that an announcement on a podium does not equal execution on the ground.
So true.
The author details these hurdles as the frictions of execution, because the premium isn't just the higher cost of domestic steel or cement, it's the labyrinth of permitting bottlenecks.
The paperwork.
Right. The text breaks down how a fully funded $2 billion facility can sit completely idle for 14 months, doing nothing but paying lawyers to shuffle environmental impact studies between state zoning boards and federal agencies.
14 months of just paying lawyers.
Yeah. And beyond the paperwork, there's a severe strain on localized infrastructure.
You mean the physical foundations that nobody thinks about until they break?
Exactly. These advanced data centers and semiconductor fabs, they demand literal rivers of ultra-pure water to wash the silicon wafers. Plus, they have city-scale electrical consumption.
City scale, wow.
So in regions like Arizona, which are already navigating historic droughts, announcing a water-intensive manufacturing plant sparks immediate community pushback.
And protracted lawsuits, I'm sure.
Tons of lawsuits. In other states, projects have their cranes ready and funding secured, but they're delayed for months, simply waiting on the delivery of specialized electrical transformers just to connect to the grid.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though.
Okay.
If the U.S. is throwing billions of taxpayer dollars to secure these strategic industries, but Europe is aggressively doing the exact same thing with their Green Deal industrial plan.
Right.
And nations in Asia are doing it too.
Right.
Aren't we just trapped in a massive, wasteful, global subsidy arms race?
That is a very real concern.
I mean, couldn't corporations just pit governments against each other? Like holding their factory locations hostage to see who will write the biggest blank check?
The text confirms that corporate hostage-taking is a massive systemic risk in this transition. When governments blindly bid against each other, taxpayers inevitably bleed while executives chase the most lucrative headlines.
So how do we stop that?
To combat this, the author highlights a regulatory mechanism called guardrails.
Guardrails.
Yeah. These are incredibly strict contracts that tie government payouts directly to verified real-world milestones.
So a company doesn't just get like a $1 billion wire transfer the day they break ground. How does that actually work in practice?
It works through phased payouts and clawback clauses. A corporation might receive an initial tranche of funding only after the physical foundation is poured.
Okay, that makes sense.
Then they unlock the next tranche when the specialized tools are actually bolted to the floor. And the final payouts might only occur when specific yield targets are met or when they prove they've hired the 1,000 local workers they promised.
And what if they fail?
If they fail, if they automate those jobs away or just abandon the project entirely, a clawback clause legally forces the corporation to return the taxpayer money.
Oh, nice.
It ensures governments are actually purchasing tangible resilience rather than just funding corporate stock buybacks.
That makes perfect sense. You force them to have skin in the game.
Exactly.
But let's say the permit's clear, the guardrails are signed, and the factory's finally built. Because constructing and operating in the U.S. is so wildly expensive, the only way these companies can turn a profit is to automate almost everything inside the building.
Yes. Automation is mandatory.
Which leads us to a massive unintended consequence for the workforce, the automation paradox.
It's arguably the most difficult social challenge of this entire boom. We are witnessing the rapid rise of the barbell workforce in advanced manufacturing.
Meaning the disappearance of the middle-class anchor jobs. Like in the 20th century, a factory provided thousands of steady, mid-skill jobs that a worker could use to buy a home and raise a family.
Today, the digital automation and robotics handle almost all of those routine mid-level operations. So the labor demand curves into a barbell shape.
Right.
On one extreme, there's a desperate need for highly specialized six-figure robotics engineers, AI integrators, and cybersecurity analysts.
And on the other extreme,
On the other extreme, there are lower-wage logistics, janitorial, and basic support roles. The middle is just hollow.
hollowed out entirely.
Yep. The U.S. faces a projected shortage of 2.1 million manufacturing workers by 2030.
2.1 million. That's insane.
The talent deficit is so severe that when TSMC was building their massive fab in Arizona, they actually had to charter flights to bring in engineers from Taiwan
Wow.
just to keep their construction schedule intact because the local talent pipeline was virtually non-existent.
And the reason that pipeline doesn't exist is incredibly frustrating. For 40 years, the American education system actively stigmatized vocational training.
Oh, complete.
We pushed an entire generation toward four-year degrees, operating on this assumption that domestic manufacturing was a dead industry. Now we need those technical skills. And you can't just spawn master robotics technicians out of thin air in a single semester.
No, you really can't.
It's like spending $1 billion on a state-of-the-art Formula One car, parking it in your garage, and then realizing nobody in your town knows how to drive it because you spent 40 years telling everyone driving was a waste of time.
That's a great analogy.
You have the hardware, but zero human capacity to actually run it.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this severe talent gap creates a deeply painful expectation gap for communities.
Tell me more about that.
Well, the book examines Ford's Blue Oval City in Tennessee as a prime case study. Constructing that massive 6-square-mile complex generated roughly 6,000 high-paying construction jobs.
Which, for the local economy, feels like an incredible boom.
Exactly. But once the scaffolding comes down, the permanent, highly automated factory will only employ about 2,500 people.
That is a staggering drop-off when the community was probably expecting a return to the glory days of mass employment.
Exactly. When the ribbon-cutting rhetoric clashes with the reality of a highly automated facility employing a fraction of the expected headcount, local resentment grows rapidly. So, to prevent these mega projects from becoming isolated islands of high-tech wealth surrounded by left-behind towns, the author argues for a fundamentally new social contract.
What does that look like?
Communities cannot rely on the sluggish education models of the 20th century anymore. We need robust, corporate-funded pre-hire academies.
Okay, yeah.
We need deep, integrated partnerships with local community colleges to build specific, highly targeted curriculum. Workers need visible ladders to climb from lower-wage support roles into technician roles through continuous apprenticeship.
And as we look at how these hyper-advanced factories actually operate day to day, a whole different kind of vulnerability emerges.
This is a critical point.
Since these facilities are effectively giant automated thinking computers, their greatest point of failure isn't necessarily physical logistics anymore. It isn't a cargo ship stuck in a canal.
No, not anymore.
It's the digital and service networks that keep the algorithms online. We really have to look at the invisible backbone of reshoring.
The hidden half of the manufacturing renaissance.
Right. Let's look at the terrifying reality of the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack in 2021.
A perfect example.
The physical infrastructure of the pipeline was completely intact. The steel was fine. Not a single drop of oil had physically leaked. But a malicious digital lockup on the business side of the network resulted in thousands of gas stations across the East Coast taping paper out of gas signs to their pumps.
It proved definitively that modern production lines fail fastest at their digital weakest link.
So this implies that reshoring isn't just about heavy metal, pouring concrete, and etching microchips. Are we talking about IT help desks and customer service representatives needing to come home as well?
Yes, absolutely.
And if so, does the math actually pencil out for these corporations when they bring those service jobs back?
It absolutely pencils out when you factor in risk mitigation. The book details why services are aggressively coming home alongside physical manufacturing.
Okay.
For decades, companies offshored their IT departments, their legal compliance teams, and their customer service centers to take advantage of massive wage arbitrage.
Just to save a few bucks.
Right. But what they sacrificed on that altar of efficiency was trust, speed, and security. The author points to Delta Airlines. They made a highly publicized strategic decision to bring their customer call centers back to the United States.
I imagine that was a massive upfront expense. Did it work?
It dramatically increased their Net Promoter Score, which is the metric companies use to gauge how likely a customer is to recommend their brand, and it slashed their issue resolution times.
Oh, wow.
The long-term brand loyalty payoff far outpaced whatever pennies they were saving by outsourcing. Companies across the board are realizing that when a crisis hits at 2 a.m., whether that's a massive winter storm grounding a fleet of aircraft, or a ransomware note blinking on a hospital server relying on an outsourced IT desk 12 time zones away, is a massive fiduciary risk.
Fiduciary risk.
Meaning the executive board's legal obligation to protect the company's assets from predictable disasters. The communication latency is simply too high, the cultural context gets lost, and the system recovery takes far too long.
Because it all comes down to proximity and control.
You need the personnel managing your critical data and handling your crisis escalations to be operating in the same legal jurisdiction, feeling the exact same urgency.
Right.
Cyber defense, digital continuity, and rapid service resolution are no longer viewed as annoying IT overhead. As the book plainly states, they are operational survival. Without those resilient digital services anchored safely at home, the physical factories simply cannot function.
So what does this all mean for you, the person listening right now?
It means a lot.
Whether you are a corporate executive trying to map out your supply chain for the next 5 years, a student trying to decide what technical skills to study, or just a curious citizen watching your local economy change, this massive rewiring affects you.
It absolutely does.
It dictates the prices you pay at the grocery store because resilience and domestic production carry a premium. It affects the security and availability of the medicine sitting in your bathroom cabinet. And it completely rewrites the economic heartbeat of your community.
The central takeaway from all the sources, the data, and the case studies is that resilience has a premium price tag, but it is the necessary cost of endurance.
The cost of endurance.
The goal of the reshoring movement isn't to build an impenetrable fortress. Total isolation or 100% self-sufficiency is a geographic and economic impossibility. The real goal is balanced interdependence.
Balanced interdependence.
We are designing industrial systems so that when the next massive storm, cyber attack, or geopolitical crisis hits, the American supply chain will bend, but it will not break.
It is entirely about outlasting the shock. And before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought, directly from the text to mull over.
Oh, this is a good one.
We've spent all this time discussing how global politics, artificial intelligence, and massive government subsidies are redrawing the industrial map of the world.
Right.
But what about the planet itself?
Right.
We mentioned earlier that these new megafads require millions of gallons of ultra-pure water daily, and these sprawling gigafactories are incredibly vulnerable to extreme weather events.
Yes, they are.
As climate shocks become more frequent and severe, will the industrial maps of the future be dictated not by where labor is cheapest or even where government tax breaks are highest, but by hydrology?
Hydrology.
Will the maps simply follow the aquifers and the floodplains, dictating where the Earth will actually allow us to build our future?
It is a profound question. We can negotiate with politicians and labor unions, but geography and water might ultimately have the final say.
It really puts our illusion of control into perspective. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We hope it gave you a new lens to view the massive changes happening right in our own backyards. Keep questioning the systems that build your world, and the next time you drive past one of these massive new construction sites, listen closely. You aren't just hearing machines, you are hearing the hum of a totally new era. Until next time.